The water stopped at 4:47 in the morning, and by sunrise, Thomas Mercer knew his family's 180-year legacy was about to drown in dust. The ancient stone well that had sustained Ironwood Ranch through droughts, depressions, and 2 world wars had finally surrendered, its depths empty for the first time since his great-great-grandfather had struck water in 1845. What Thomas would uncover in his desperate attempt to save the ranch wouldn't just restore the water, it would rewrite everything he thought he knew about the land his family had bled into for 6 generations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas stood at the wellhead as dawn broke over the Montana high plains, his calloused hands gripping the worn stone rim where generations of Mercers had drawn water for livestock, irrigation, and life itself. The silence from below was suffocating. No echo of moving water, no distant trickle promising relief, just the hollow emptiness of a resource exhausted beyond recovery. Behind him, Ironwood Ranch stretched across 850 acres of rolling grassland and timber, its boundaries marked by weathered fence posts and the kind of intimate knowledge that came from walking the same earth your ancestors had worked. The main house, built in 1847 from hand-hewn logs and expanded over decades, stood like a testament to Mercer's stubbornness, its foundation stone set deep enough to outlast any family foolish enough to abandon it. But stubbornness couldn't conjure water from dry rock. Thomas was 46 years old, lean and weathered in the way of men who spent their lives outside, his face carved by wind and responsibility into sharp planes that made him look older than his years. His hands bore the scars of ranch work, rope burns and barbed wire cuts, fence mending and cattle handling written into every callous and crooked finger. He'd taken over Ironwood when his father died 15 years ago, a transition that came too early and carried too much weight, and he'd held on through market crashes, disease outbreaks, and weather that seemed increasingly determined to break him. The well failure felt personal, like the land itself had given up. "How bad is it?" The voice belonged to his daughter Sarah, 23 years old and carrying 2 thermoses of coffee as she picked her way across the rocky ground. She'd come home from her environmental science program at the university 3 months ago, ostensibly to help with the summer workload, but Thomas suspected she'd sensed the desperation in his voice during their weekly calls. The ranch was failing, and they both knew it. "It's dry," Thomas said, accepting the coffee she offered. "Completely dry. I dropped a weighted line down this morning, hit bottom at 287 feet with no water." Sarah's face, so much like her late mother's that it sometimes stole Thomas's breath, went pale. "That's impossible. This well has never failed, even during the drought of '88. "I know." Thomas cut her off, not harshly but with the finality of a man facing facts he couldn't change. "Your grandfather used to say this well was blessed, that it tapped into something deeper than any drought could reach. Apparently he was wrong." They stood in silence, watching the sun climb over the eastern ridgeline and illuminate a ranch that was slowly dying. The past 5 years had been brutal. Climate patterns had shifted, bringing less snow in winter and hotter, drier summers that stressed the grassland beyond its capacity to recover. Beef prices had collapsed, just as feed costs skyrocketed, creating a financial vice that squeezed harder every season. 3 neighboring ranches had sold out to development companies in the past 2 years, their legacy operations carved into ranchettes for wealthy urbanites seeking weekend escapes. Thomas had sworn Ironwood would never join them, that the Mercer name would remain on this land as long as he drew breath. But a ranch without water wasn't a ranch at all, just expensive dirt waiting for a for sale sign. "We could drill a new well," Sarah suggested, though her tone carried little conviction. "There are companies that specialize in deep drilling, geothermal surveys." "With what money?" Thomas asked, the question rhetorical, but weighted with the reality they both understood. The ranch account held barely enough to cover next month's loan payment and feed through winter. Drilling a new well would cost upwards of $80,000, money they didn't have and couldn't borrow against a property already leveraged to its limit. His son Marcus, 26 and working construction in Billings to help supplement the ranch's failing income, had offered to take out personal loans. But Thomas had refused, unwilling to saddle his children with debt for a dream that might already be dead. Better to admit defeat than drag them down with him. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The ranch foreman, Ray Hutchins, found them still standing at the wellhead an hour later, having already checked the livestock tanks and confirmed what they'd feared. Without the well, they had maybe 3 days of stored water before they'd need to start trucking it in at ruinous expense or reducing the herd to numbers the remaining sources could sustain. "There's talk in town," Ray said carefully, his weathered face neutral but his eyes sympathetic. He'd worked for Thomas's father, and now Thomas himself, 30 years of loyalty that made him more family than employee. Jensen Development is still buying. They're paying premium prices for properties with water rights, even if the water's questionable. Thomas felt something cold settle in his chest. Walter Jensen was a developer from California who'd been systematically acquiring ranches in the valley, promising to preserve their character while carving them into luxury lots that destroyed everything that made them worth preserving. Selling to Jensen would keep the Mercer name on a signpost at the entrance to what would become Ironwood Estates, but everything his family had built would be gutted, replaced by trophy homes and manufactured authenticity. "I'd rather burn it," Thomas said flatly. Sarah and Ray exchanged glances but said nothing. They understood. Some legacies were worth more than their market value, even if that meant watching them die with dignity rather than selling them for profit. The rest of the day unfolded with the grim efficiency of people preparing for disaster. They calculated water usage, prioritized livestock, and made contingency plans that all involved some version of the ranch's slow collapse. By evening, exhausted and covered in the dust of a day spent managing crisis, Thomas found himself back at the wellhead, staring down into darkness that seemed to mock 6 generations of Mercer faith in this land. His great-great-grandfather, Benjamin Mercer, had chosen this spot in 1845 after walking the property with a hazel branch, using dowsing techniques brought from his family's farm in Virginia. The old journals in the ranch house described how Benjamin had felt the branch pulled downward so forcefully it left splinters in his palms, how he'd hired local laborers to dig through 120 feet of limestone and clay until they'd struck an underground stream that flowed cold and clear enough to sustain a ranch in country where water meant everything. Every generation since had maintained that well with something approaching reverence, its stone walls reinforced and rebuilt, its mechanism updated from hand crank to electric pump, but its core unchanged. The well wasn't just infrastructure, it was the ranch's beating heart, the proof that the Mercers belonged here. And now it was empty. Thomas made a decision born of desperation and legacy in equal measure. If the well had truly run dry, he needed to know why. Not for practical reasons, an empty well was empty regardless of cause, but because not knowing felt like betraying everyone who'd trusted this water before him. He would go down into the well himself, examine the rock where the spring had been, and at least understand what had killed his family's dream. "You're doing what?" Sarah's voice carried disbelief and alarm when he explained his plan over dinner. "Dad, that's insane. The well's nearly 3 feet deep. If something goes wrong—" "I've got climbing gear from when we used to do rock work in the high pastures," Thomas interrupted. "Ray and I will rig a safety system. I just need to see it for myself." Marcus, who'd driven out from Billings after hearing about the well failure, shook his head. "This isn't about seeing anything. This is about you not being able to let go." The accusation stung because it carried truth. Thomas had spent 15 years trying to hold on to something that the world seemed determined to take away, fighting market forces and climate change and his own exhaustion to keep the ranch viable. Going down into the well was probably foolish, maybe even dangerous, but doing nothing felt like surrender. "Maybe you're right," Thomas admitted, "but I'm going down anyway." They spent the next day preparing, Ray helping Thomas assemble equipment, while Sarah researched well safety protocols with the intensity she usually reserved for academic papers. Marcus watched with resigned acceptance, recognizing his father's stubborn determination as a Mercer trait he'd inherited himself. By late afternoon, they had everything ready: climbing harness, battery-powered lights, communication radio, and enough rope to reach the bottom with safety margin. The descent began at dusk, Thomas lowering himself hand over hand down the stone walls his great-great-grandfather had helped construct. The well shaft was roughly 4 feet in diameter, tight enough that his shoulders occasionally scraped the walls but wide enough to maneuver. The stone was cool and slightly damp near the surface, fitted together with the kind of craftsmanship that belonged to an era when permanence mattered more than efficiency. His headlamp illuminated maybe 15 feet ahead, creating a small circle of light in the surrounding darkness. The radio clipped to his harness crackled with Sarah's voice checking his progress, a lifeline to the surface world as he descended into the Earth's throat. At 150 feet, the walls changed character, the fitted stone giving way to natural limestone, carved smooth by centuries of water flow. Thomas could see the high water marks where the spring had been, mineral deposits creating bands of color in the rock face. He paused, catching his breath and letting his eyes adjust to patterns in the stone. Something was different. Where the limestone should have shown the organic irregularity of natural formation, there were marks that seemed almost deliberate, straight lines scored into the rock at intervals, too regular to be accidental, but too old to be modern tool marks. "Sarah," he spoke into the radio, "are there any records of improvements to the well beyond the upper section?" "Just the original construction log from 1845, her voice crackled back. "Why?" "I'm seeing marks in the limestone that don't look natural. Hold on." He continued down, the straight lines becoming more pronounced, eventually revealing what looked like deliberate scoring in the rock face. At 230 feet, where the spring had been strongest, the marks formed something that made his breath catch. Symbols or letters, weathered by water flow but unmistakably intentional, carved into the well wall in a pattern that suggested writing. Thomas pulled out his phone, snapping photographs as best he could in the confined space. The carvings were crude but purposeful, and among them he could make out what looked like dates, numbers that his exhausted mind struggled to process. 1847, 1851, 1854. His great-great-grandfather had carved these. But why? At 280 feet, 5 feet from where his weighted line had hit bottom that morning, Thomas found the answer. The spring hadn't run dry. It had been deliberately sealed. Fitted into the limestone with the same careful craftsmanship as the upper well walls was a stone plug, precisely shaped to block what had been a natural fissure in the rock. And carved into that plug, in letters deep enough to survive water erosion, were words that made Thomas's head spin. B. Mercer, 1847, sealed by necessity, God forgive us. His hands trembled as he reached the bottom, his boots finding purchase on the sealed stone. The plug was roughly 3 feet in diameter, fitted so precisely into the fissure that only the carved warning revealed it wasn't natural formation. He pressed his ear against the stone, and despite its thickness, he could hear something. Not the sound of flowing water, but a different kind of movement, like wind through a cave or the whisper of air pressure equalizing through distant passages. There was space behind this plug. Possibly a lot of space. "Dad, everything okay?" Sarah's voice crackled with concern. "You've been quiet for 5 minutes." Thomas stared at the carved warning, his mind racing. His great-great-grandfather hadn't found water at this depth. He'd found something else and then deliberately sealed it, installing the spring feed higher up as a cover. But sealed what? And why? "I'm coming up," he said finally. "But I think we need to have a family meeting. There's something down here I don't understand." The climb back took twice as long as the descent, Thomas's mind churning through implications as his body mechanically worked the rope. By the time he emerged into the Montana twilight, his family was waiting with the kind of concerned expressions people wear when they think someone they love might be losing their mind. He showed them the photographs on his phone, the carved symbols and dates, the deliberately sealed plug at the bottom where the spring should have been. "Grandpa Benjamin sealed the well?" Marcus said slowly. "But that makes no sense. Why would he dig 280 feet just to seal it?" "Unless he found something he didn't want anyone else to find," Sarah suggested, her scientific mind already analyzing possibilities. "A secondary chamber, maybe, or an underground formation he thought was dangerous." Ray studied the photographs with the intensity of a man who'd spent his life reading the land. "Those marks on the walls, they look like mining notations. My grandfather worked the copper mines up north. They'd mark veins and passages that way." Thomas felt a chill despite the warm evening. What if the well was never just about water? What if Benjamin found something down there and the well was cover for why he kept access to it? The question hung in the air, ridiculous and compelling in equal measure, but the evidence was literally carved in stone. Deliberate excavation beyond any reasonable depth for water, systematic marking of the descent, and finally a carefully sealed chamber with a warning that suggested guilt or fear, or both. "We need to go back down," Thomas said, the decision forming even as he spoke it. "Not tonight, but soon. We need to open that seal and see what's behind it." "Dad," Sarah's voice carried the careful tone of someone trying to reason with potential madness. "Even if there is something down there, disturbing it could be dangerous. That seal was put there for a reason." "The reason might have been protecting whatever's behind it," Marcus countered, his contractor's mind already working through logistics. "If there's a chamber or passage, opening it might restore water flow from a different source." Thomas knew they were both right and both wrong. Opening the seal was risky, possibly pointless, maybe even dangerous. But his great-great-grandfather had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide something beneath Ironwood Ranch, and whatever it was had been undisturbed for 178 years. The Mercer family was facing extinction regardless. The ranch would be sold or foreclosed within months. Before that happened, Thomas needed to know what legacy Benjamin had really left them. Not just land and livestock and the crushing responsibility of stewardship, but secrets buried so deep that 6 generations had lived above them without knowing they existed. "We go down tomorrow," he decided. "All of us who are willing. We document everything, we proceed carefully, and we finally learn what the first Mercer was hiding beneath our land." As darkness settled over Ironwood Ranch, Thomas stood at the wellhead one last time, staring down into the shaft that had defined his family's history. The water was gone, the ranch was dying, and everything he'd fought to preserve was slipping away. But beneath it all, sealed in stone and marked with warnings from a man dead nearly 2 centuries, was something his ancestor had deemed worth protecting even at the cost of honesty. Tomorrow, the Mercers would break that seal and confront whatever truth lay beneath their dying land. For better or worse, the legacy they'd always known was about to change into something none of them could yet imagine. Dawn came with the kind of crystalline clarity that made the Montana high plains feel both infinite and suffocating. Thomas stood in the ranch kitchen, watching his children move around the space with the muscle memory of people who'd grown up here. Sarah measuring coffee with the same chipped scoop her grandmother had used. Marcus checking equipment laid out on the scarred wooden table, where 4 generations of Mercers had eaten meals and made decisions that shaped their lives. Ray arrived as the sun cleared the ridgeline, carrying additional climbing gear and a crowbar that looked older than the ranch itself. "Found this in the equipment barn," he said, setting it on top. The table with a metallic thunk. "Your grandfather used it for fence work. Figured if we're breaking through stone that's been sealed since 1847, we might as well use tools that remember when this place was young." The descent plan was methodical, born from Sarah's research and Marcus's construction experience. They would go down in pairs, Thomas and Marcus first to assess the seal and determine the best approach, then Sarah and Ray as backup if additional hands were needed. They'd rigged a pulley system at the wellhead for lifting tools and debris, installed additional lighting at intervals down the shaft, and established radio protocols for communication. But no amount of preparation could address the fundamental question that hung over the operation like smoke. What had Benjamin Mercer found that required sealing behind stone and silence? Thomas went down first, the rope familiar now after yesterday's descent, his body remembering the rhythm of hand-over-hand movement through the narrowing darkness. Marcus followed 20 feet above, his younger strength evident in the easy way he controlled his descent. The battery-powered lights they'd installed created pools of illumination at regular intervals, transforming the well shaft from a throat of darkness into something almost navigable. At 280 feet, Thomas clipped his harness to the anchor bolt they'd installed during yesterday's exploration and waited for Marcus to join him. The sealed chamber sat before them, Benjamin's carved warning visible in the harsh LED light. "Sealed by necessity. God forgive us." "Those words bother me," Marcus said, running his gloved fingers over the carved letters. "Necessity is one thing, but asking God for forgiveness suggests he did something he knew was wrong." Thomas had spent half the night thinking about the same thing. His great-great-grandfather's journals, preserved in the ranch house library, painted a picture of a religious man, devout in the practical way of frontier settlers who saw God's hand in survival and providence in good harvests. What could such a man have found that required both concealment and divine absolution? Only one way to find out, Thomas said, positioning the crowbar against the edge of the stone plug where it met the surrounding limestone. Ready? The first strike sent vibrations up Thomas's arms, the impact solid and unyielding. The plug had been fitted with the kind of precision that came from desperate determination, each edge carved to match the natural fissure so exactly that barely a seam showed. It took 20 minutes of systematic work, Marcus and Thomas alternating strikes while the other held the light, before they felt the plug shift, just a fraction of an inch, but enough to confirm it could be moved. There's air pressure behind this, Marcus observed as they paused to catch their breath. Feel that? Every time we strike, there's a slight pushback. This isn't sealing a dead space. There's atmosphere moving behind. The stone. Sarah's voice crackled through the radio clipped to Thomas's harness. Dad, what's your status? You've been quiet for 15 minutes. We've got movement on the plug, Thomas reported. Maybe another 20 minutes of work. Everything stable up there? All good. Ray's monitoring the rope tension. Just be careful. The next series of strikes came faster, both men working with renewed urgency as the plug began to separate from the surrounding rock. Limestone dust filled the air, coating their clothes and skin with fine white powder that made them look like ghosts laboring in the earth's depths. The sound of metal on stone echoed up the well shaft, a percussive rhythm that felt like knocking on a door that had been locked since before the Civil War. Then, with a grinding crack that sent both men scrambling backward on their harnesses, the plug shifted forward 6 inches, stopped by debris behind it, and released a rush of air that smelled of minerals and moisture and something else Thomas couldn't immediately identify. Old wood, maybe, or the particular mustiness of spaces that had been sealed from sunlight for generations. We're through, Marcus breathed, his headlamp illuminating the gap around the displaced plug. Dad, there's definitely a chamber back there, a big one. They worked for another 30 minutes, gradually shifting the plug until they'd created an opening large enough to pass through. Thomas went first, contorting his body through the gap into darkness that felt vast in a way the well shaft never had. His headlamp swept across space, revealing stone walls that opened into a natural cavern roughly 30 feet across and 12 feet high, its ceiling lost in shadows beyond his light's reach. But it was what filled the cavern that stole his breath and made his hands tremble on the rope. Gold. Not nuggets or dust, but a stream, an actual flowing stream of water running through a channel carved in the cavern floor, its bed lined with what looked like gold, or so rich and pure that it glittered even in the dim light. The water flowed from a fissure in the eastern wall and disappeared into another crack at the western end, creating an underground river that had probably run through this cavern for thousands of years, depositing gold with patient geological certainty. Marcus came through the opening behind him, his sharp intake of breath the only sound beyond the gentle rush of water. For a long moment, neither man spoke, both trying to process what they were seeing. How much gold are we looking at? Marcus finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might make the vision disappear. Thomas moved closer to the stream, kneeling at its edge and reaching down to touch the water. It was cold, pure, flowing with the steady pressure of an underground source that had never known drought. His fingers found a piece of ore embedded in the stream bed and he worked it loose. A chunk of rock, roughly, the size of his palm, shot through with veins of gold so thick they looked like frozen lightning. I don't know, he admitted, holding the ore up to catch the light. But enough that Benjamin Mercer decided it needed to be hidden, enough that he sealed a fortune behind stone and pretended he'd only found water. They spent the next hour exploring the cavern, documenting everything with their phone cameras while Sarah and Ray monitored from the surface, their excited voices crackling through the radio as Thomas described what they'd found. The cavern was natural, its walls showing the organic formation patterns of limestone dissolution, but human hands had been here too. Near the stream's entry point, they found evidence of crude mining, places where the gold-bearing rock had been deliberately fractured and removed, creating a small pile of processed ore stacked against the western wall. And beside that pile, wrapped in oilcloth that had miraculously survived nearly 2 centuries in the cavern's stable environment, were Benjamin Mercer's journals. Not the public journals kept in the ranch house library, but private accounts that Thomas opened with hands that shook from more than exertion. The first entry was dated August 1845, written in the careful script of a man who understood he was documenting something momentous. Today I found what every man dreams of and fears in equal measure. The underground river runs rich with gold, more wealth than 10 generations of Mercers could spend. I have sampled the ore and confirmed its purity. This land could make our family wealthy beyond imagination. But as I stood in that cavern, watching the gold shine in my lamplight, I felt only dread. Gold brings out the worst in men. It transforms neighbors into rivals, friends into enemies, family into thieves. I have seen what gold fever does to communities, how it corrupts and destroys everything it touches. This valley is peaceful now, its people good and hardworking. If word spreads of this discovery, that peace will be shattered. Men will come, our land will be invaded, our family threatened. The Crow Nation, whose treaty protections are already fragile, will face new pressure as gold seekers justify any violence in pursuit of wealth. I cannot be responsible for such destruction. Better to seal this chamber, tap the underground river higher up for our water needs, and let the gold remain hidden. Better my family remains modest ranchers than become wealthy men who destroyed a valley's soul. Thomas read the passage aloud to Marcus, his voice catching on phrases that resonated with painful clarity across 178 years. His great-great-grandfather had found a fortune and deliberately walked away from it, choosing the harder path of ranch labor over the easy wealth that would have transformed everything. He gave up millions, Marcus said, the disbelief evident in his tone. Maybe tens of millions, depending on how much gold is actually here. He could have been rich. We could have been rich. And instead, we've spent 6 generations barely scraping by. He chose integrity over wealth, Thomas countered, though he heard the defensiveness in his own voice. He protected the valley from the kind of destruction that gold rushes always brought. Look what happened in California, in Colorado. Entire landscapes destroyed, native populations decimated, communities torn apart. Benjamin prevented that here. By condemning his descendants to poverty and struggle, Marcus shot back, his frustration finally breaking through. Dad, I've watched you work yourself to exhaustion for 15 years trying to keep this ranch alive. I've taken construction jobs I hate to help make loan payments. Sarah came home from a research program because she knows we're going under. And the whole time, there's been a fortune sitting right beneath our feet, sealed away because our great-great-great-grandfather decided his descendants didn't deserve the choice. The accusation hung in the cavern's damp air, heavy with the weight of generations caught between nobility and stubbornness. Thomas wanted to argue, to defend Benjamin's decision as the selfless act it clearly was. But he couldn't ignore the truth in his son's anger. How many Mercers had struggled, sacrificed, and ultimately failed to make the ranch profitable? How many dreams had been deferred or abandoned because money was always tight and options always limited? And now, with the ranch on the brink of foreclosure and their legacy days away from extinction, they'd found the very thing that could have prevented all of it. We need to tell Sarah and Ray, Thomas said finally, avoiding the larger argument. And then we need to decide what we do with this information. The ascent back to the surface felt longer than the descent, both men quiet with their own thoughts as they climbed hand over hand toward daylight. When they finally emerged, blinking in the afternoon sun, Sarah and Ray were waiting with expressions that shifted from relief to confusion as they registered the strange mixture of triumph and conflict on the men's faces. Thomas told them everything, showing them the photographs, the ore sample he'd brought up, and reading passages from Benjamin's journals. Sarah listened with the focused intensity of a scientist processing unexpected data, while Ray's weathered face remained carefully neutral, decades of discretion making him reluctant to comment on family matters. When Thomas finished, Sarah was the first to speak. So we're sitting on a gold mine, literally. She paused, choosing her words carefully. This changes everything, doesn't it? The ranch's financial problems, the water crisis, all of it becomes manageable if we extract even a fraction of what's down there. Or it destroys everything Benjamin tried to protect, Thomas countered. Word gets out about underground gold on Ironwood Ranch, and we'll have mining companies, prospectors, government officials, and God knows who else crawling all over this property. The ranch as we know it would cease to exist. Marcus had been silent since reaching the surface, but now he turned to face his father with an expression that mixed anger and pleading. "The ranch is already ceasing to exist, Dad. We're 3 months from foreclosure. 3 months, and you're talking about protecting it by keeping a fortune sealed in the ground? That's not protection. That's just slow-motion suicide dressed up as principle." "Your brother has a point," Ray said quietly, his first contribution to the debate. "I understand honoring Benjamin's wishes, but Benjamin wasn't facing foreclosure. He wasn't watching everything his family built get sold off to developers who'll turn it into vacation properties. Times change. Maybe the reasons for keeping this secret don't apply anymore." Thomas looked at each of them, seeing the fracture lines forming in his family's unity. Sarah's scientific pragmatism warring with her respect for ecological preservation. Marcus's frustration with generational poverty clashing against guilt for challenging their ancestors' choice. Ray's loyalty to the Mercer family leaving him torn between supporting Thomas's instincts and acknowledging the harsh mathematics of survival. "We don't have to decide right now," Sarah suggested, her mediator instincts kicking in. "Let's at least take a few days to research what extracting the gold would actually involve. Environmental impact, legal requirements, market realities. Make an informed decision instead of an emotional one." But Thomas knew that some decisions couldn't be researched away. Either they honored Benjamin's sacrifice and accepted the consequences, or they broke faith with the very principle that had defined Ironwood Ranch for 6 generations, that some things mattered more than profit. That night, unable to sleep, Thomas found himself in the ranch house library, surrounded by Benjamin's public journals and the private accounts they'd recovered from the cavern. He read by lamplight, tracking his great-great-grandfather's reasoning through entries that spanned the first years of Ironwood's operation. Benjamin had been tempted. The journals made that clear. He'd extracted some gold, enough to confirm the deposit's richness, enough to briefly imagine what wealth could mean for his family. But other entries revealed his deeper thinking. Met with Red Hawk today, a Crow elder who remembers when his people held all these lands. He speaks of broken treaties, of white settlers who honor agreements only until resources make betrayal profitable. "I cannot become another white man whose word means nothing when wealth beckons. I gave my word that Ironwood Ranch would be a good neighbor, that we would respect the land and the people who stewarded it for generations before us. Keeping the gold secret is the only way to honor that promise." Thomas closed the journal, feeling the weight of his ancestors' moral clarity. Benjamin hadn't just been protecting his family from gold fever. He'd been keeping a promise to indigenous neighbors who had every reason to distrust white settlers' intentions. Breaking that seal meant breaking that faith, adding Ironwood to the long list of properties where white families enriched themselves at the expense of principles and people. But it also meant survival. It meant Sarah could pursue her research without worrying about the ranch collapsing. It meant Marcus could choose his own path instead of taking jobs he hated to support a failing operation. It meant the Mercer name could remain on this land not through stubborn poverty, but through the kind of financial security that allowed families to thrive across generations. The knock on the library door pulled Thomas from his thoughts. Marcus stood in the doorway, his expression carrying none of the anger from earlier, just bone-deep exhaustion. "Can't sleep either?" Thomas asked. Marcus shook his head, moving to sit in the worn leather chair their grandfather had favored. "I keep thinking about what you said, about how gold fever destroys communities, and you're right, it does. I've seen it in modern terms. Oil booms that turn towns into temporary camps, mining operations that leave nothing but contamination when they move on. But Dad, we're not talking about strip mining the property or opening it to outside interests. We're talking about controlled extraction, enough to save the ranch and secure our future. That's not greed, that's survival." "Benjamin would say that's how it always starts," Thomas replied, though his conviction felt weaker than it had hours ago. "That the first compromise leads to the next, until everything you wanted to protect is gone." "Maybe," Marcus conceded. "Or maybe Benjamin was working with the information and values of his time, and we have to make decisions based on ours. The world is different now. Environmental regulations exist. Indigenous rights have legal protections, however imperfect. We're not 19th century settlers operating with no oversight. We could do this responsibly." Thomas wanted to believe that, wanted to imagine a version of events where they extracted the gold, saved the ranch, and somehow maintained the integrity Benjamin had fought to preserve. But he'd lived long enough to know that money changed people, that the best intentions often crumbled under financial pressure and opportunity. "Your sister is researching the legal requirements," Thomas said finally. "Let's see what she finds out. Then we'll make a decision as a family." Marcus nodded, standing to leave, but paused at the doorway. "Dad, I'm not trying to betray our legacy. I'm trying to save it. There's no honor in letting Ironwood die just to prove we're noble enough to starve on principle." After Marcus left, Thomas sat alone in the library, Benjamin's journals stacked around him like accusations or justifications, depending on perspective. Outside, the Montana night pressed against the windows, vast and indifferent to human struggles with integrity and survival. The well was no longer dry. Water flowed beneath their land, abundant and pure, flowing through gold that could solve every problem they faced. His great-great-grandfather had sealed that solution away, believing the cost of wealth exceeded its benefits. But Benjamin Mercer had never faced foreclosure, had never watched his children sacrifice their dreams to prop up a failing operation, had never felt the particular desperation of seventh-generation responsibility, knowing that failure meant erasing every sacrifice that came before. Thomas pulled out a piece of paper and began writing, not in Benjamin's formal journaling style, but in the plain language of a man trying to reason through an impossible choice. "If we take the gold, we save the ranch, but risk becoming something Benjamin feared. If we leave it sealed, we honor his choice, but lose everything anyway. Maybe the real question isn't what Benjamin would do, but what the land needs from us now, and I don't know how to answer that." He left the paper on the desk, a message to himself or his children, or maybe his long-dead ancestor, then climbed the stairs to bed. Tomorrow would bring more arguments, more research, more pressure to make a choice that felt increasingly like choosing between different kinds of betrayal. The ranch house creaked around him, timbers settling in the night cold, a sound he'd heard 10,000 times, but tonight felt like the building itself, sighing under the weight of secrets too heavy to bear. Somewhere beneath it all, gold flowed through darkness, waiting as it had waited for millennia, patient and pure and utterly indifferent to the moral struggles of the temporary creatures who claimed ownership of the dirt above. Thomas closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, he lay awake listening to the ranch breathe around him, wondering what his great-great-grandfather had felt on similar nights, knowing he'd found fortune and chosen to hide it, believing that sacrifice would protect something more valuable than wealth, and wondering if, 178 years later, the Mercers had earned the right to make a different choice. Sarah's research took 3 days, and when she finally called the family meeting, her expression carried the complicated weight of someone who'd found answers that only made the questions harder. They gathered in the ranch house dining room, the same space where Mercers had made family decisions since 1847, its walls lined with photographs documenting generations of faces that shared the same determined jawline and weather-reading eyes. "The legal situation is more complex than I expected," Sarah began, spreading documents across the table's scarred surface. "Montana law regarding mineral rights, indigenous land claims, environmental protection statutes, it's a maze. But the summary is this: we could legally extract the gold. It's on our property. Below the surface rights we own. But the process would require environmental impact studies, state permits, possibly federal oversight depending on how we classify the operation. And there's no way to keep it quiet. The moment we file for permits, word gets out." Thomas had expected this, but hearing it confirmed still felt like a blow. There was no quiet extraction, no subtle way to access the fortune beneath their feet without transforming Ironwood into exactly what Benjamin had feared: a spectacle of wealth that would attract attention, pressure, and the slow erosion of everything that made the ranch worth saving. "What about the water?" Marcus asked, his tone more measured than it had been during their argument. "Could we access the underground river without touching the gold, solve our immediate crisis without dealing with the larger issue?" Sarah nodded, flipping to another document. "Theoretically, yes. We could drill laterally from a point above the cavern, tap into the stream before it enters the gold deposit. It would be expensive, maybe $40,000 for the drilling and casing, but manageable compared to a new well. The water would save the ranch in the short term." but leave us broke in the long term, Marcus finished, understanding the implication. We'd have water but still face all the same financial pressures that were killing us before we found the gold. Ray, who'd been listening quietly from his position leaning against the doorframe, finally spoke. There might be another option. Hear me out before you dismiss it. He moved to the table, his weathered hands tracing patterns on the wood as he organized his thoughts. What if you don't extract the gold, but you don't keep it completely secret either? What if you make it a conservation easement? Thomas frowned, not following. What do you mean? I mean you legally protect the land in a way that prevents mining while documenting the reason why. Create a permanent conservation designation that acknowledges the gold exists, but establishes that its preservation is more valuable than its extraction. Environmental organizations do this all the time, protecting habitats or watersheds by restricting development rights. You could do the same here, protecting Benjamin's choice as part of the land's heritage. Sarah's eyes lit up with the kind of excitement she usually reserved for breakthrough research. That's actually brilliant. Conservation easements can provide tax benefits and sometimes direct payments from organizations dedicated to land preservation. And it wouldn't make us wealthy, but it could provide enough financial stability to modernize our operations, maybe develop the sustainable agriculture programs I've been researching. And it would honor Benjamin's reasoning while adapting it to contemporary frameworks. Marcus looked skeptical. So we'd officially document that we're sitting on a fortune and choosing not to touch it. That's going to be a hard sell to creditors and neighbors who think we're insane. Better than the alternatives, Ray countered. Extract the gold, face the environmental and social consequences Benjamin feared, probably lose the ranch's character in the process, or keep it completely secret, keep struggling, and eventually lose to foreclosure anyway. This way, you make Benjamin's choice a strength instead of a burden. You turn it into a legacy of conservation that has real value in the modern world. Thomas stood and walked to the window, looking out over land that 7 generations of Mercers had worked, protected, and passed forward. The afternoon sun painted the grasslands in shades of gold that had nothing to do with minerals and everything to do with the alchemy of light and life. This was what Benjamin had really been protecting, not just the peace of the valley, but the particular beauty of a landscape that remained itself, untransformed by the desperate hunger for wealth that had scarred so many other places. We'd need to talk to the Crow Nation, Thomas said slowly, the pieces coming together in his mind. If we're protecting this land in part because of Benjamin's promise to be good neighbors, they should be part of that conversation. Their elders should know the full story and have a voice in how it's preserved. Sarah was already making notes, her organizational skills shifting into high gear. I can reach out through my university contacts. There are protocols for tribal consultation on conservation projects. And if the Crow Nation endorses the easement, it strengthens the entire framework, makes it less about one family's eccentric choice and more about honoring historical relationships and environmental stewardship. For the first time since finding the sealed cavern, Thomas felt something like certainty settling in his chest. This wasn't the easy answer Marcus wanted. Wasn't the complete honoring of Benjamin's secrecy that part of Thomas believed was right, but it was a path forward that acknowledged both the gold's existence and the reasons for leaving it undisturbed. It transformed a hidden burden into a declared principle, and in doing so, gave the Mercer legacy new meaning for a changed world. We'll need that water drilling done first, he said, turning back to face his family. Before we can commit to anything long-term, we need to know the ranch can survive. Ray, can you contact the drilling company you mentioned? Get them out here for an assessment? Ray nodded, already pulling out his phone. I'll call them today. They're good people, locals who won't ask too many questions about why we're drilling at an angle into limestone. The next week unfolded with the purposeful energy of people who'd finally found direction after drifting. The drilling crew arrived and spent 2 days setting up their equipment at a point Sarah had calculated would intersect the underground river 50 feet above the sealed cavern. Marcus took a week off from his construction job to help coordinate the operation, his engineering knowledge proving invaluable in translating the family's unusual requirements into specifications the drilling crew could work with. Sarah divided her time between researching conservation easement law and reaching out to environmental organizations that might partner with them on the project. Within 3 days, She'd made contact with a Crow Nation cultural preservation officer named James Whitehorse, whose great-grandfather had known Benjamin Mercer and remembered stories about the white rancher who'd refused to participate in land grabs during the Indian Wars. "Mr. Whitehorse wants to visit the property," Sarah reported after a lengthy phone conversation. "He says his elders would need to assess the spiritual significance of the site before they could endorse any formal protection arrangement. But he sounded intrigued, said it was rare for white families to consult with them on land decisions that didn't require legal permission." The drilling reached the underground river on the 8th day, and when the first surge of cold, pure water erupted from the casing, Thomas felt tears he hadn't allowed himself burn hot in his eyes. The crew's celebration was professional, but genuine. They knew the stakes for the ranch, had drilled enough dying wells across Montana to recognize the sound of water as salvation. "Flow rate is strong," the crew chief reported, showing Thomas the pressure readings. "You're looking at roughly 200 gallons per minute, stable and consistent. This will supply all your ranch needs with plenty of margin for expansion. And the water quality," he whistled appreciatively, "this is some of the purest groundwater I've tested. You could bottle this stuff." By the end of the second week, the new well was operational, and livestock tanks were filling with water that tasted exactly like the spring that had sustained Ironwood for 178 years, because it was the same water, just tapped 50 feet higher than Benjamin's original discovery. The ranch's immediate crisis was over. What remained was the harder question of its long-term future. James Whitehorse arrived on a Thursday morning, driving a truck that had seen as many hard miles as any ranch vehicle. He was perhaps 60, his face carrying the kind of weathered dignity that came from a lifetime spent navigating between traditional ways and contemporary realities. He greeted Thomas with a firm handshake and clear eyes that seemed to assess character before words. "My great-grandfather spoke of Benjamin Mercer," James said as Thomas led him toward the wellhead. "Said he was different from most white settlers, actually kept his promises, didn't try to push for more land when other ranchers were grabbing everything they could. Our elders considered him a man of honor." Thomas felt the weight of that assessment, understanding it as both compliment and burden. "I'm not sure I can live up to that reputation, but I'm trying to honor the choices he made, even when they're difficult." They descended into the well together, James moving with the confidence of someone comfortable in dark places. When they reached the opening to the sealed cavern and Thomas explained what lay beyond, James was quiet for a long time, his headlamp illuminating the stone plug and Benjamin's carved warning. "Gold," he finally said, the word carrying layers of meaning. "The thing that broke more treaties than any other single cause, and your ancestors sealed it away." He touched the stone plug, his fingers tracing Benjamin's carved words. "This is a sacred choice. Not sacred in the Christian sense necessarily, but sacred in the sense of recognizing that some things should remain undisturbed because their disturbance would corrupt something essential." They climbed back to the surface, and James spent the next hour walking the property, occasionally stopping to examine plants or study the lay of the land in ways that suggested he was reading a text Thomas couldn't fully see. Finally, as they stood on the ridge overlooking the ranch's southern boundary, James turned to face Thomas directly. "My people have a principle," he said. "Seventh-generation thinking. Every decision should be made with consideration for how it will affect the seventh generation to come. Your Benjamin Mercer understood this, even if he didn't use those words. He found wealth that would have enriched 5 or 6 generations of his family, but he recognized it would impoverish the seventh by destroying the land's integrity and the community's peace." "That's exactly what I've been struggling with," Thomas admitted. "How to balance immediate needs against long-term consequences. My son thinks I'm being stubborn, choosing principle over survival." James smiled slightly. "Your son thinks in the time frame most people think in, 1 or 2 generations ahead, maybe 3 if they're unusually wise. But the land thinks in geological time. The gold has been there for millions of years. The river that deposits it has flowed for eons. What's the rush to extract it now? What makes our generation's needs more urgent than the 7th generation's need for a world not completely ransacked for short-term gain?" The conversation continued as they walked back to the ranch house, where Sarah had prepared lunch and Marcus had returned from coordinating the final well testing. Over food that Sarah had deliberately made from ranch ingredients, beef they'd raised, vegetables from Rebecca's garden, bread made with Montana wheat. The discussion expanded to include practical frameworks for protecting the land. James brought insights from tribal conservation efforts, explaining how indigenous nations were increasingly using modern legal structures to protect sacred sites and traditional territories. Sarah contributed research on conservation easements and environmental trusts. Marcus, slowly shifting from skepticism to cautious interest, asked pointed questions about the financial sustainability of permanently restricting their own mineral rights. "You're not really restricting anything you were using," James pointed out. "The gold has been sealed for 178 years. Keeping it sealed while creating legal frameworks that generate some income and tax benefits actually increases your options rather than limiting them. You're transforming a hidden liability into a declared asset." By evening, the outline of a plan had emerged. Ironwood Ranch would establish a conservation easement protecting the land in perpetuity from mining and development, explicitly acknowledging the sealed gold deposit as part of its heritage. The Crow Nation would co-sign the easement, recognizing it as fulfillment of Benjamin Mercer's original promise to be a respectful neighbor. Environmental organizations had already expressed interest in providing funding for sustainable agriculture research on the protected land, turning the ranch into a working laboratory for practices that could be scaled to other family operations. "It's not going to make us wealthy," Thomas said that night as the family gathered after James's departure, "but it'll make us stable. And maybe that's what we really needed. Not a fortune, but a sustainable path forward that doesn't require us to betray everything this ranch represents." Marcus was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I still think Benjamin could have found a better way. But I understand what you're doing, Dad. You're turning his choice into something that serves the present instead of just honoring the past. That's not blind loyalty. That's adaptation." The legal work took 3 months, involving attorneys, environmental consultants, and numerous meetings with Crow Nation representatives and conservation organizations. In that time, the ranch began its transformation from a struggling family operation to something larger, a demonstration project for sustainable agriculture practices that integrated traditional knowledge with contemporary environmental science. Sarah officially joined the operation full-time, her research grant from an environmental foundation providing funding for projects that would have been impossible under the old financial constraints. Marcus continued his construction work but started transitioning toward specialized projects, helping other ranchers implement water conservation systems and sustainable infrastructure improvements that he'd learned through Ironwood's transformation. The formal easement signing took place on a clear autumn day, almost exactly 1 year after Thomas had first descended into the well. Representatives from the Crow Nation, conservation organizations, and state agencies gathered at Ironwood Ranch for what had become more than a legal ceremony. It was an acknowledgement that land stewardship could take forms beyond simple ownership, that legacy could be preserved through conscious choice rather than just inheritance. James Whitehorse spoke during the ceremony, his words carrying weight that transcended their immediate context. When white settlers came to this land, most took everything they could. Benjamin Mercer found gold and chose to leave it. His descendant Thomas Mercer found that same gold and chose the same path, but with an addition, he made that choice public, turned it into a teaching that might guide others. This is what true wealth looks like, not metal in the ground, but integrity in the heart. After the official proceedings, as the gathering shifted to more casual celebration, Thomas found himself back at the wellhead, looking down into darkness that had held his family's secret for so long. Ray joined him, the old foreman's presence comfortable and undemanding. "Your grandfather would be proud," Ray said finally. "Not just of keeping the gold sealed, but of finding a way to make that choice meaningful for your kid's generation." "I keep wondering what Benjamin would think," Thomas admitted, "whether he'd see this as honoring his decision or betraying it by making it public." "I think he'd understand that times change, and the ways we protect what matters have to change too," Ray replied. "He kept it secret because that was what his time required. You made it public because that's what your time requires. Same principle, different application." As winter approached, Ironwood Ranch settled into rhythms both familiar and transformed. Cattle still grazed the high pastures, hay still needed cutting and baling, fences still required constant maintenance. But running through it all was a new current of purpose. Researchers documenting sustainable practices, visitors coming to learn about conservation easements, young ranchers seeking advice on how to protect family land from development pressure. The foundation income, combined with tax benefits from the conservation designation and Sarah's grant funding, had given the ranch financial breathing room it hadn't known in decades. Not wealth, but sufficiency. Not abundance, but security. The difference between those states, Thomas was learning, made all the difference. On Christmas Eve, the family gathered in the ranch house, a tradition unbroken even in the hardest years. But this year felt different, lighter somehow, as if a weight they hadn't fully recognized had finally lifted. Sarah was developing research that might help struggling ranches across the region. Marcus was planning to start his own sustainable infrastructure company. Even the land itself seemed to breathe easier, its protection ensured not just through one family's determination, but through legal frameworks that would outlast any single generation. Thomas stood at the window after dinner, watching snow begin to fall over fields that had known 7 generations of Mercer footsteps. Somewhere beneath that snow, beneath the frozen ground and limestone layers, gold still flowed through darkness, as pure and undisturbed as it had been for millennia. His great-great-grandfather had found it and chosen to let it be. Thomas had found it again and made the same choice, but in doing so had transformed it from a secret burden into a declared legacy. The land had kept faith with the Mercers, providing what they needed even when they thought it had failed them. And the Mercers had kept faith with the land, choosing its integrity over its exploitation. That seemed like the kind of inheritance worth more than any mineral deposit, the kind of wealth that could sustain 7 more generations if they honored the same principle. "Dad?" Sarah's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "We're about to do presents. You coming?" Thomas turned from the window, from the land that had defined his life and would outlive him, toward the family that made all those choices meaningful. "Yeah," he said, moving toward the warmth and light of the living room. "I'm coming." Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the landscape in fresh whiteness that made everything look new while changing nothing essential. The well stood silent at the property's heart, its depths holding water and gold and the accumulated weight of choices made by people who understood that real wealth couldn't be extracted, only lived. And somewhere in the sealed cavern 280 feet below, Benjamin Mercer's journals rested beside the stream, their pages speaking across 178 years to descendants who'd finally understood his message, that the land doesn't belong to the people who own it, but to the generations who will inherit it, and that the truest measure of stewardship isn't what you take from the earth, but what you choose to leave undisturbed for those who come after. The river kept flowing, the gold kept gleaming in darkness, and Ironwood Ranch kept standing, not despite the fortune beneath it, but because the Mercers had learned that some treasures are preserved by leaving them alone, some legacies are honored by adaptation rather than blind repetition, and some choices echo forward through time with a clarity that transforms burden into blessing. 3 years later, the land remembered everything differently. Spring came early to Ironwood Ranch, breaking winter's hold with the kind of gentle insistence that made Thomas think of his mother's hands, coaxing seedlings from cold soil. He stood in the same spot where he'd first learned the well had failed, but now the landscape before him carried a different story. One written in the green surge of restored pastures, the steady flow of water through new irrigation lines, and the researchers' vehicles parked near the rebuilt equipment barn that doubled as a field laboratory. The ranch hadn't just survived. It had become something Benjamin Mercer might never have imagined but would have recognized in principle. A place where working the land meant more than extracting its resources, where legacy measured itself not in accumulated wealth, but in maintained integrity across generations. Sarah emerged from the research barn, her field clothes dusted with the kind of honest dirt that came from hands-on work rather than observation. At 26, she'd published 2 papers on sustainable grazing practices that were being implemented across Montana and Wyoming, her research grounded in the daily reality of Ironwood's operations. The foundation funding had allowed her to hire 2 graduate students, young people whose enthusiasm reminded Thomas of his own early years on the ranch, before exhaustion and financial pressure had dimmed that initial fire. "The soil samples from the eastern quadrant are showing remarkable recovery," she said, joining him at the fence line. 3 years of rotational grazing and the microbial diversity has increased by 60%. We're essentially watching topsoil rebuild itself in real time. Thomas nodded, understanding what she wasn't saying, that healthy soil was its own kind of gold, more valuable in the long term than any mineral deposit because it sustained life rather than merely representing it. The conservation easement hadn't just protected the sealed cavern beneath their feet. It had forced them to think differently about every aspect of the ranch's operation, to measure success by ecological metrics rather than purely economic ones. Marcus pulled up in his truck, the company logo on the door reading Mercer Sustainable Systems in simple lettering that honored family without advertising it. His business had grown faster than any of them had anticipated, fueled by increasing numbers of ranchers who recognized that climate change and market pressures required different approaches than those their fathers had used. He'd hired 4 employees and was considering expanding into Colorado, but he still made time to help at Ironwood during critical seasons. The water monitoring system is showing stable flow rates, Marcus reported, consulting his tablet. The underground river hasn't fluctuated more than 5% in 3 years. Whatever geological formation feeds it seems remarkably consistent. They'd installed sensors throughout the aquifer system, both to ensure the ranch's water security and to gather data that might help other properties understand their own groundwater resources. The information was shared freely through Sarah's research network, another way Benjamin's sealed discovery was benefiting the broader community without the gold itself ever being touched. Ray called from the barn, waving them over with the unhurried gesture of a man who'd learned that ranch work required urgency but rarely panic. At 73, he'd officially retired twice but kept showing up every morning with the excuse that he needed to make sure the young folks didn't mess things up too badly. Everyone understood it for what it was, the inability of a man who'd given his life to this land to simply walk away from it. "We've got visitors," Ray announced as they approached, the documentary crew from that public television program. "They're here to film the segment on conservation ranching." Thomas had forgotten about the filming. In the years since they'd established the conservation easement, Ironwood had become something of a case study, featured in environmental publications and agricultural journals, as an example of how family ranches could adapt to contemporary challenges while maintaining their essential character. The attention had been uncomfortable at first, but he'd come to see it as part of their responsibility. If their choice could inspire other families to consider conservation easements or sustainable practices, then the discomfort was worth it. The film crew spent 3 days on the property, capturing footage of daily operations and conducting interviews that forced Thomas to articulate things he'd previously only felt. The director, a woman named Patricia Chen who'd grown up on a rice farm in California, seemed to understand the nuances they were trying to convey. "What strikes me most," she said during a break in filming, "is that this isn't a story about sacrifice. You didn't give up the gold reluctantly. You actively chose to protect it, and in doing so, created something arguably more valuable, a working model for how rural communities can maintain their identity and viability without exploiting every resource to exhaustion." Thomas considered this, watching his children work with the easy competence of people who knew their purpose. "I think my great-great-grandfather would say we didn't create anything new. We just remembered something old. That the land's value isn't in what you can extract from it in one generation, but in what it can provide across many generations if you treat it with respect." The filming concluded with a ceremony Thomas had been quietly planning for months. James Whitehorse arrived with a delegation of Crow Nation elders, their presence lending gravity to what might otherwise have seemed merely symbolic. They gathered at the wellhead, the sealed entrance to the cavern now marked with a bronze plaque that told Benjamin's story in words carefully chosen to honor both his choice and the indigenous wisdom that had informed it. The plaque read, "Benjamin Mercer, 1845. In this place, one man found gold and chose water. His descendants honor that choice, and the 7th generation thinking it represents. Some treasures are preserved by leaving them undisturbed." James spoke in Crow first, then translated for the gathered group. "My ancestors would say that Benjamin Mercer understood something many white settlers didn't, that the earth is not a resource to be consumed, but a relative to be respected. This plaque acknowledges that understanding and commits future generations to the same wisdom. It's a promise written in bronze instead of paper, and perhaps it will last longer because of it." After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed and normal ranch work resumed, Thomas found himself alone with the plaque, running his fingers over the engraved letters. Somewhere beneath his feet, 280 feet down through limestone and time, gold still flowed through darkness, as pure and untouched as it had been when the earth first formed it. Benjamin's journals remained sealed in the cavern, deliberately left undisturbed as a gesture of finality. That chapter was closed, its lessons learned and integrated, but not endlessly revisited. The ranch continued through summer and into autumn with the rhythms that had sustained it for 181 years, though the details had changed in ways both subtle and significant. The cattle operation was smaller now, focused on quality over quantity, producing grass-finished beef for premium markets that valued sustainable practices. The hayfields had been partially converted to diverse native plantings that supported pollinator populations and improved overall ecosystem health. The old equipment barn housed research equipment alongside tractors, and visiting researchers were as common as neighboring ranchers. In October, as the aspens turned gold on the mountain slopes and the first frost touched the valley, Thomas received word that his father's younger brother, the uncle who'd left Montana 40 years ago and rarely returned, had passed away in Arizona. The news carried complicated emotions. Uncle Richard had been the Mercer who'd rejected ranch life entirely, who'd pursued wealth in real estate development and achieved a version of success that included expensive cars and a house in Scottsdale, but no connection to land or legacy. The funeral brought Thomas face to face with cousins he barely knew. Richard's children who'd grown up with money, but without the particular rootedness that came from working the same soil your ancestors had worked. They spoke of their father's accomplishments in terms of property value and investment returns, and Thomas recognized the gulf between their understanding of success and his own. But he also recognized something else, that Richard's choice to leave had been as valid as Thomas's choice to stay. Not every Mercer needed to be a rancher for the ranch to survive. The family tree could branch in different directions, and some of those branches would lead away from the land entirely. What mattered was that at least one branch in each generation chose to stay, to maintain the connection and carry the responsibility forward. On the flight home, Thomas thought about succession in new ways. Sarah would likely take over operations eventually, her research and ranch management skills making her a natural inheritor of his role. Marcus would remain connected but pursue his own path, supporting the ranch through his business expertise without being bound to its daily demands. And somewhere in future generations not yet born, other Mercers would face the same choice, to stay or leave, to maintain or transform, to honor the past while building the future. Winter settled over Ironwood with the decisiveness it brought to high country, snow covering the land in whiteness that made everything look pristine while hiding the complex life continuing beneath. Thomas spent more time in the ranch house library that season, reading Benjamin's public journals with new understanding. His great-great-grandfather hadn't just been a rancher, he'd been a philosopher who thought deeply about stewardship, responsibility, and the relationship between present needs and future consequences. One entry, dated January 1872, seemed particularly resonant. "Today my grandson asked me why we don't mine the hills for gold as our neighbors do. I told him that some men plant apple trees knowing they'll never eat the fruit, that they plant for grandchildren not yet born. Our ranch is like that. We maintain it not for ourselves alone, but for the Mercers who'll work this land when we're dust. That's a kind of wealth no gold can match." Thomas copied the passage into his own journal, the continuation of a family practice that now stretched across 7 generations. Someday, perhaps, his grandchildren would read his entries and understand the choices he'd made, the sealed gold he'd honored by leaving undisturbed, the conservation easement that had transformed burden into blessing. Spring returned, as it always did, breaking winter's hold with gradual warming that coaxed life from frozen ground. The ranch prepared for another season, another cycle of planting and growing and harvesting. But this spring brought something new. Sarah's announcement that she was pregnant, that by autumn there would be an 8th-generation Mercer, a child who would grow up on land protected by choices made long before their birth. The news filled Thomas with an emotion he struggled to name, something between joy and solemnity, celebration and weight. This child would inherit Ironwood Ranch, but they would also inherit the responsibility of maintaining the conservation easement, of honoring Benjamin's choice, of thinking in seventh-generation terms about decisions that affected the land's future. On a morning in late May, Thomas walked the property boundaries as he'd done countless times across 30 years of managing the ranch. But this time, he walked them with different eyes, seeing not just what was, but what would be. The eastern pasture where Sarah's research had restored topsoil health, the well that tapped the underground river without disturbing the gold, the barn that housed both cattle and cutting-edge environmental science, the conservation easement marker that declared this land permanently protected from mining and development. Each element represented a choice. Benjamin's choice to seal the gold, Thomas's choice to honor that decision publicly, the family's collective choice to transform protection into purpose. And underlying all of it was the land itself, patient and enduring, continuing to provide what the Mercers needed even when what they needed changed across generations. Ray found him on the ridge overlooking the southern boundary, the same spot where James Whitehorse had spoken about seventh-generation thinking 3 years before. The old foreman moved more slowly now, but his eyes remained sharp, still reading the land with the accumulated wisdom of 7 decades. "Been thinking about your grandfather," Ray said, settling onto a weathered log that had served as informal seating for as long as Thomas could remember. "About how he used to say that good ranching was mostly about knowing when to act and when to wait. Seems like you've learned that lesson pretty well." Thomas smiled, understanding what Ray wasn't saying, that keeping the gold sealed had been an act of strategic waiting, of recognizing that not every resource needed immediate exploitation. "I had good teachers. And you'll be a good teacher yourself," Ray replied, nodding toward the ranch buildings visible in the valley below. "That 8th-generation Mercer is lucky. They'll grow up on land that's protected and productive, that has purpose beyond just profit. That's a legacy worth more than any gold deposit." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the land breathe with early summer vitality until ranch responsibilities called them back to work. But the moment stayed with Thomas, becoming another layer in the accumulated memory this ridge held. Benjamin surveying newly claimed land in 1845, countless Mercers since watching seasons change and cattle graze, and now Thomas, understanding that each generation added their own story to the land's ongoing narrative. By August, when Sarah's pregnancy was showing and the research barn was hosting its 3rd annual sustainable ranching workshop, Ironwood Ranch had become something Benjamin Mercer could never have precisely envisioned, but would have recognized in spirit. A place where the land was honored, where legacy meant more than inheritance, where the choice to preserve rather than exploit had created abundance of a different kind. The documentary about conservation ranching aired that fall, featuring Ironwood prominently and telling Benjamin's story to audiences who'd never considered that refusing wealth could be its own form of wisdom. The response surprised Thomas. Letters from other ranchers facing similar pressures, environmental organizations seeking partnerships, young people interested in careers that combine traditional ranching with ecological stewardship. What had felt like a lonely choice, keeping the gold sealed when extraction could have solved every financial problem, had resonated with people who understood that short-term thinking was destroying landscapes and communities alike. Benjamin's decision, preserved and honored across 181 years, had become relevant again in ways its originator could never have anticipated. Sarah gave birth in November, a daughter they named Rebecca after Thomas's late wife, her grandmother who'd believed in the land's capacity for renewal even during the hardest years. Thomas held his granddaughter for the first time in the same ranch house where 7 generations of Mercers had been born, feeling the weight and wonder of continuity, that this tiny person would someday inherit everything he'd fought to preserve. The choices he'd made would shape her life in ways neither could yet imagine. On a clear December morning, with new snow reflecting sunlight so bright it hurt to look at, Thomas stood once more at the wellhead, his granddaughter bundled in his arms. He'd brought her here intentionally, wanting her first visit to this spot to be marked in family memory even though she wouldn't remember it herself. "Down there," he said softly, knowing she couldn't understand but needing to speak the words anyway, "is gold your great-great-great-great-grandfather found and chose to leave undisturbed. Because of his choice and the choices that came after, you'll grow up on land that's protected, purposeful, and productive. That's your inheritance, Rebecca, not wealth extracted from the earth, but wisdom about how to live with it." The baby made small sounds, her dark eyes tracking the movement of snow crystals in the air, completely unconcerned with legacy or gold or the weight of 7 generations. Thomas smiled, understanding that this was exactly right, that each generation should face their inheritance fresh, unburdened by excessive reverence for the past, free to adapt while maintaining core principles. The land would teach her, as it had taught every Mercer since Benjamin first walked these boundaries in 1845. The land would show her what mattered and what didn't, what endured and what faded, what was worth preserving and what needed transformation. And when her time came to make choices about Ironwood Ranch's future, she would have the freedom to choose wisely because previous generations had chosen well. Thomas walked back toward the ranch house, his granddaughter warm against his chest, the Montana winter bright and cold around them. Behind him, the wellhead stood silent, marking the entrance to chambers that held water and gold and the accumulated wisdom of people who'd understood that real wealth couldn't be extracted, only lived. Ahead, smoke rose from the ranch house chimney, promising warmth and family and the continuation of simple rhythms that had sustained the Mercers across nearly 2 centuries. The land breathed around him, winter dormant but alive with potential, holding secrets it chose to keep and offering gifts to those patient enough to receive them properly. Somewhere beneath his feet, gold still flowed through darkness, as pure and untouched as when the earth first formed it, waiting as it had always waited, while above it, generations of Mercers learned that the truest treasures were the ones you chose to leave undisturbed, for the land, for the future, and for the quiet certainty that some legacies were measured not in what you took, but in what you preserved for those who came after. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.